Steve Broglio. I'm an associate professor of athletic training in the School of Kinesiology, University of Michigan. Director of the Neurotrauma Research Lab. Also a member of the University of Michigan Injury Center. 40 years old. I have a PhD in exercise science. I'm a certified athletic trainer.
Cool. Where'd you get your PhD?
Georgia, University of Georgia.
So you went, well, I guess where'd you start with the bachelor's?
Got my bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Went on to get my master's at Pittsburgh, and then finished up down in Georgia.
Nice little travel.
Up and down the East Coast, and then took my first job at Illinois. Was there at University of Illinois. Was there for about 5 years, and came up here. Been in Michigan. This is my 4th year here.
Okay. You like it pretty well?
It's been great. I can do without some snow, but the university is great. The people here are great. The town is awesome. I really like it.
Cool. And then how many years have you been in this particular position at Michigan, and then maybe just in the profession as a whole?
So I've been doing concussion research since around 99, 2000. I actually started as an undergraduate, did an honors project. We ended up publishing that, and then kind of started ramping up, as I went through my education, and got into tenure track lines. Came to Michigan in 2011, and I had a lab down at Illinois, so I kind of brought that lab up here with me and started right away.
Okay. And then can you just take me kind of through your background here, kind of what you do, your day-to-day activities, stuff that, makes the job what it is?
Sure. So as a faculty member, I think my appointment within the school is similar to probably all faculty members, tenure track lines. So we do a portion of our work is research related. Another portion is teaching related. So I teach within the athletic training program here. And then we do another portion of our job is related to service. So that's serving on committees, whether they're within the school or they're on the university or even outside of the university, working for a professional organization. So I serve on a couple committees for the National Athletic Trainers Association, helping with grant reviews and journal reviews and those sorts of things.
Okay. So lots to keep you busy.
It's some days you wish there were more hours in the day, and some days you don't, because that's just more emails to come in that you got to take care of. So.
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you obviously have a lot on your plate, and then throw on top of that kind of the work you do with this NCAA study. Can you just take me through that and why Michigan kind of is one of the leading schools for it?
Yeah, so the NCAA DoD project, the CARE Consortium, that's a collaborative work, obviously between the NCAA and the DoD or the funding agencies, but I'm working closely with Mike McCrae at Medical College of Wisconsin, Tom McAllister down at Indiana University School of Medicine. We're running the clinical portion of the investigation at Michigan, or out of Michigan. Mike is running what's termed the Advanced Research Core, and then Tom handles kind of the administration of it. It's a very large project, and there's a lot of oversight that needs to be taken care of. So his role is actually quite important to all this.
And then if I read right, it's kind of a 3-year study.
Right. So the initial funding is for 3 years. We're just now starting to ramp up for year 2. We're winding down year 1 and ramping up year 2. And we're hoping we can expand or continue after year 3 with some ongoing enrollment. And then really our big goal is to do a longitudinal study. So all the athletes that we're enrolling now, or at least within the first 3 years, and we're estimating about 25,000 total athletes roughly. We're hoping that we can track them for 10 years after they get out of school, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and really make it a long-term study on how concussion affects neurological function well beyond college.
So this is the big deal of concussion studies, if you will.
I think the timing is right. People have an interest in it. The two agencies, the NCAA and the DoD, came together, and the joint effort has really helped move things along. I don't think we could do it with just one of them. I think we need both. There's certainly enough interest in it. We've had huge support from all of our member schools. People that want to join, people that are in it. People are very excited. They want answers too. They want to know what the answers are, so they can inform their athletes, inform their parents, inform their coaches. So.
Okay. And then just kind of take me through just the kind of the work that's done here that made U of M appealing for the NCAA to reach out to.
Yeah, I don't know what the NCAA was exactly looking for, but I think we've had a pretty strong track record in doing concussion work. Like I said, I started in right around 99 or 2000, so 15 or so years of experience. Mike McRae's been doing it for 25 years maybe. Tom McAllister's kind of in the same boat. So collectively we've got a lot of experience. I think one of the things, the application that we put in was not just a single site. It wasn't just Michigan. It was a collaborative project across 3 schools. We brought different perspectives, unique perspectives that balanced all the PIs, that balanced each other out. Their strengths were very complementary to each other. So I don't want to say it was just a Michigan thing. I certainly don't think it was. I think it was kind of the collective effort between the 3 of us that kind of brought us to the front.
Okay. And then obviously you kind of laid out some of the hopes you guys and the NCAA, DOD, everyone involved has. But what's, I guess, the primary objectives that you're really trying to focus in on and accomplish with
Sure.
this?
So I think we have short and we have long-term goals with the grant. Short-term goals, we want to understand the natural history of concussion. And that means what are the clinical signs and symptoms and what is the time course that it takes for those things to resolve post-injury. The second part of that, the natural history of concussion, is kind of what's the neurophysiological resolution. So we've got a sense that probably within 5 to 10 days post-injury that people will go back to normal on baseline clinical tests. But what we have a lesser understanding of what happens at like a cellular level. So that's another question we want to answer is how does clinical resolution mimic or not mimic what we see kind of on fMRI or DTI, different blood biomarkers and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So those are the short, kind of what we term the short-term goals. So that's 3 to 5 years. And then, as I mentioned previously, we also are interested in what are the real long-term effects of the injury. So what happens 20, 25, 30, 35 years post-injury? An individual has, maybe it's a wrestler. They have 1 or 2 injuries while they're in college, but then that's it. They're done wrestling, and then they go out and they have a normal life. Are they really at risk for anything 35 years later, a 55-year-old adult?
So is that something that you guys are working on and to get athletes to join in with that venture, or is that something that'll be approached at a later time?
So we're collecting contact information on the athletes now. So that'll give us the opportunity to follow up with them in 20 years, 30 years, whatever the case may be. So that's something that we're laying the groundwork for it now. But to be able to carry that out in 20 years I'll be around, 35 years I might be retired by that. So maybe somebody else will do it.
Yeah. Okay. And then you obviously you mentioned wrestlers, and obviously concussions are. Anybody can get a concussion. But kind of the focus of my documentary is just to look at concussions in football. How big of a role is football been playing in your guys' study, and what goes on in that sport?
So I think one of the things that makes our study unique to work that's been done in the past is we're enrolling every varsity athlete that's on campus. So we get cross country and swimming all the way through football, ice hockey, lacrosse. So we're covering everybody. And that's actually one of the questions we want to look at is, does the cross country runner have a different recovery pattern than an offensive lineman? And those are things, we'll have that data. We'll be the first group that have collected, we'll have enough data that we'll be able to actually look at that sort of thing. Football certainly is an issue. It's probably at the forefront, but it's not the only sport that has injury. Women's soccer has a similar injury rate to football. Women's ice hockey, some of the early evidence kind of suggested it was higher than football, although some newer evidence is kind of bringing it back down to almost on par. So there's a number of things. Football gets a lot of attention, but it's not the only one that's out there. Every sport can have a concussion. Obviously the odds get higher when you get into the contact and close sports.
Okay. And then can you just kind of talk about your role with the study and what you're specifically hoping to accomplish? I know you said 35 years might be retired, but just kind of what you envision.
Yeah, so my role right now at the study is I'm running the clinical study core. So this is more of the clinical tests that are associated with concussion. So we get extensive baseline on all of our athletes that are enrolled. So this is personal history, personal medical history, personal concussion history, sport history, family medical history, And then we also do symptom evaluations, we do our status screening, we do our cognitive screening, we do a postural control evaluation on all these athletes, and on every athlete. This is all prior to the season before they start participating in the sport. Then in the event of the injury, then we'll get them again within 6 hours, usually on a sideline immediately after injury or within a couple hours, maybe after a game. 24 to 48 hours post-injury, again when they're asymptomatic. So this is the point where they start the return to play progression. So this is usually about 7 to 10 days post-injury. Then 4 or 5 days or so after that, we get them at what's termed the return to play point. So this is when they're cleared to return to their sport with unrestricted participation. And then we get them again at 6 months post-injury. So we get a number of post-injury time points as well. We are estimating of the 25,000 or so athletes that will enroll, that will capture probably about 350 was our initial estimate. I think we're going to probably go over that, which is good. We'll get more data. So we're excited about that. But I'm handling that portion of the study. Mike McCrae over at Medical College of Wisconsin, he's handling the Advanced Research Core. That's involving impact biomechanics. So they put sensors in helmets, or they're using a non-helmeted sensor in like women's hockey, or excuse me, women's soccer. I think they're going to look at women's lacrosse. Then he's also doing blood draws on all the athletes. They're doing post-injury MRI on all the athletes. So they're getting very detailed, granular level information on all these individuals. And again, we'll have all this information, all this pre-injury information, as well as really good information about injuries now that we're collecting. And then, so 30 years from now, we can say, oh, okay, this was the characteristic of your injury, and then that may or may not lead to these outcomes when you're 50 years old.
Okay. And my guess is that there's never been anything done to this magnitude, so I would ask in relation to that why this study, I guess, is so important.
Yeah, so this is definitely the largest prospective concussion study that's ever been done. Definitely in the number of athletes, I think in the amount of information that we're collecting on these individuals as well. And I think it's going to really answer some really hard questions that we haven't had the power to do in the past. So for example, if you were to carry out this study at one location, if we did it here at the University of Michigan or at Oklahoma, you might capture, 20 or 25 concussions a year. Mm-hmm. So in the first 3 months of the investigation, we captured 100 concussions, right? And when we're shooting that, we will, over time, we'll hit at least 350 is our kind of our benchmark. But my guess is we'll go over that point. So to capture that volume of information would take decades at a single institution. So the power here lies in the number of institutions that we have enrolled, the number of people participating, and we can capture all that data that people want much quicker. Now, when we start talking about what happens in 20 years or 30 years, that just takes time. We can't speed that up. But to get that core group of information collected and gathered, we can do that much faster based on the size.
With everything that's collected and the data and just evolving technology as a whole, is there a hope maybe that come 20, 30 years there's no concussions? Obviously that's probably not going to happen,
right.
but like kind of getting towards that.
Sure. I personally don't think we'll ever get to a point where there's zero concussions. I don't think it's going to happen. There's always going to be the cross-country runner that trips on a route and hits his head, and there's just really nothing you can do about that. But I do think we will get to a point where technology, training, injury prevention, I think all those things will improve and concussion rates will come down. Rules changes. Or stronger enforcement of existing rules. So all those things will lead to reduced rates, and I think part of what we're hoping is that we can feed into some of those things. So for example, we're collecting information on, I'll just use football as an example, when during the game or during the practice did the injury occur, right? And if we see a pattern where certain drills in practice or certain plays in the game lead to a really high rate of concussion, maybe we need to take a look at those and say, maybe we need to make a modification to this rule or to this play or this practice, and that could reduce rates. Okay. So the NFL did that a couple years ago when they changed their kickoff rule, and the rate of concussion during kickoffs dropped, I don't want to say to zero, but it's dropped quite dramatically since then.
Which is always a good thing. And then can you just kind of take me through your background with concussions. Obviously, you've said you've done a lot of research with them, but just kind of take me through how you got to where you are today with concussions.
So I started in concussion research somewhere around 1999 or so. My advisor as an undergraduate was a concussion researcher. Started hanging out in his lab, more doing kind of helping with the clinical interpretation, clinical testing interpretation. And then that led into a senior project. So that was kind of my first real research project. I mean, I was assisting with some other stuff, but that was the first one that I kind of ran in, so to speak. And I just enjoyed it. It was fun. I think the thing that turned me on to it was like, I'm answering a question that nobody has ever answered before. This has never been done before, and I'm answering that question. And it was fun. And so I kind of gravitated towards it and started asking more questions. And unfortunately, every time you answer one, there's 10 more that come up right after that. But that progressed. My initial work was kind of looking at soccer heading and different effects that soccer heading had. That was kind of the popular theme at the time. And then that progressed more into kind of how good some of the tests are that we use. So the computer tests that we use, the balance tests that we use, symptom evaluations. How good are those at helping with the concussion diagnosis and the return to play decision? And then that kind of shifted into some of the impact biomechanics. We started focusing mostly on high school students. There's far more high school students that participate in sports than there are at the college and professional level. So we really started focusing there. We felt that they were highly underrepresented, not represented in the medical literature. So trying to understand how they're different, what makes them different, and trying to assist them and kind of providing some medical coverage. And then we did that for a number of years, and then we started looking into some of the long-term effects, changes in gait, changes in balance, changes in fine motor control, how you use your hand 5 years after you've had an injury, 10 years after you've had an injury. And then now we're kind of morphing back, well, I shouldn't say morphing back, but we've kind of backed up a little bit, looking at this with this collegiate population, kind of what happens in the short term, and then also with the eye on what's going to happen in 20 years or 30 years.
I guess a good question to always ask is what is a concussion? What for the Joe Schmo who sits at home on the couch and watches a football game and his favorite player goes out,
right?
What is it?
So a concussion is the result of what's termed a biomechanical impulse that's transmitted to the brain. So it's a direct impact to the head, so a helmet-to-helmet collision or a helmet to a knee or elbow or something like that. Or it can be this kind of impulsive maneuver. So somebody gets hit in the chest and kind of get this whiplash motion, and that impulse travels up. You can think of the brain inside of the skull as kind of almost like a piece of Jell-O. Has kind of almost that consistency, and so if you shook like a bowl of Jell-O, you kind of can imagine the brain kind of shaking and vibrating like that. So when that happens, it actually stretches the neurons that are inside of the brain that kind of make up the brain tissue, and that alters the way that the neurons function. So neurons send a signal by shifting sodium and potassium across the membrane, and they generate an electrical signal because of that. So when you shake it, it kind of disrupts the natural pattern, how they function. So a concussion is not what we term as a structural injury. There's no bleeding involved. You can't take someone to an emergency room and give them an X-ray or a CT scan or an MRI. Nothing will show up. Everything will look normal because it's the ions that have been disrupted. The functionality of the brain has been disrupted, not the structure of the brain. So when that impulse happens, and you get that functional disturbance, that pathway has been disrupted. Right? So you can almost think of it like almost like a traffic jam, right? You're traveling down the road, you're on a 4-lane highway, there's an accident, and that blocks that pathway. So what we do if we're in the car, we get off the exit, we kind of go down the country road, go down to the next exit and get back on. We get to wherever it is we're going, it just takes us a little bit longer. Right? So the brain actually kind of does a similar type of thing. That pathway is disrupted, the normal ionic function is disrupted, but it'll start recruiting different areas of the brain to achieve the same goal. You can do it, you just don't do it as well, right? Or your reaction time is slowed down because it's using a part of the brain it's not used to, or it's got to reroute the signal to accomplish the goal that it's trying to achieve. Over time, the car accident gets cleared out, and then the road flow, traffic patterns on that road return to normal. Same thing in the brain. 5, 10, 7 days, or 5, 7, 10 days, the brain starts to return to normal and things kind of get back to their normal level of function.
So lots going on up that you
top,
don't even know.
Yeah, and I mean, this is we're pretty sure that's what happened. 99% sure. There's really good evidence to suggest that that's it, and that we don't have any reason to believe otherwise.
Obviously, you said, there, and I wouldn't imagine it either. The day where we see 0 concussions, that's just not a realistic ideal. But what's ways that, I guess, steps that can be taken to prevent? I know you were talking about rule changes and that kind of stuff. How big is safety precautions and measures in sports for possible prevention?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it. So certainly technology, newer helmets will help. Right? We'll get newer helmet standards, better materials, things that absorb impact forces better. That'll help reduce. And this is in contact collision sports where you wear a helmet. Right? I think when we talk about rules enforcement, I think that's something that new rules. I think that's something that can have a pretty dramatic effect. So soccer is a good example. No helmet. But you used to be able, when you went up for a head ball, you could lift your elbow up and see a lot of bloody noses and concussions as a result. Well, you can't lift your elbow anymore. Concussion rates drop. It doesn't stop head-to-head contact, which is actually the number one cause of concussions in soccer, is head-to-head contact. But I think maybe like a game like football, you can really, and they've started doing this a little bit, where it's blatant head-first contact, not trying to wrap up, right? I think strict enforcement of those rules with harsher penalties, so whether that's at the professional level, finding somebody, at the college level, ejecting somebody, at the high school level, you could have, in my opinion, a review system on Monday morning, and the kid loses the next Friday night, right, if it's deemed to be an intentional play. It does get tricky. There's definitely, there's going to have to be a balance, because if you look at, a lot of times you have an offensive player catch a ball, a defensive player will be coming in, and the defensive player is lined up maybe for the chest, but the offensive player, as they catch the ball and see the defensive player, they'll crouch down to protect themselves, and they actually bring their head down to the level of the defensive player. Mm-hmm. Right? Defensive player didn't do anything wrong. So how does that, who's in trouble at that point? And that's part of the reason why I don't think we'll ever get to 0 concussions. Mm-hmm. But certainly I think if people lose playing time, if people are fined, I think those are penalties that are harsh enough that will make people think about it before they do it again.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of it. Just if you watch a football game, for instance, you see guys slowing down or thinking twice about what they're doing.
Right.
But let's talk a little bit about speed of the game, because I think that plays a big role in how injuries occur. I mean, obviously, anything can happen at any given time, but how it, from each level, you see, from like high school, you did some research, college now, professional, each level is so different, and everybody's bigger, stronger. How much of an impact does that have on the size of people, how the impact that they're getting hit at, right, et cetera?
Yeah. So if you look at there's no good biomechanical data at the professional level. There's pretty good biomechanical data at the college and high school level. The average magnitude of impact across the high school and the college level is actually about the same. Now, when you get into the upper, like the top 1%, top 0.5% of all impacts, then the college kids hit a little bit harder. We kind of have speculated that it's a scaled game, right? So you have, at the high school level, you get, basically everybody is about the same size. They're 6 foot, 180 pounds, right? But then when you go to the college level, now everybody is 6'2", 210, 220, right? On average, right? I know there's variance, but on average. So it becomes a scaled game. Yes, they move faster and hit harder, but they are also bigger, more muscular, and better able to protect themselves from a muscular standpoint. The 170-pound receiver in college that's got the pencil neck. Now the 200-pound receiver in high school that's got the pencil neck. Now you got the 200-pound receiver at college that he's got a much beefier neck and he can protect himself. The other thing that people speculate on is that people that are more injury prone, they're more susceptible to not only concussions but knee injuries, ankle injuries, whatever. They're not going to make it to the college level, and they're definitely not going to make it to the professional level. They're going to get filtered out. If you're always injured, you're just not going on. It's just the way it's structured. So there is some speculation that as you move up the ranks, those individuals are less likely to be injured because they have a higher tolerance to impact. And we don't have good data to support that, but it's a theory that's been floated.
And how much of it too? Obviously, I like that comparison, the guy pencil neck to beefier, but I like that. But how much is there a sense of, for any sport, it's almost become a sense of risk that they are accepting that, obviously in life, any of us could trip, fall,
right,
hit anything. But, for a sport, they're in a more controlled state of a game and what's going on with their competition. But is there a sense of, risk that they kind of have to just accept that I might tear my Achilles, right, or my ACL might go out, anything like that?
Yeah, I think, there's inherent risk in everything you do, right? There's risk of crossing the street, getting in the car and driving wherever it is you're going to drive to. I think it is our duty to inform athletes of what that risk is. I think what has happened, however, is the media has gotten so far in front of where the science is that people are assuming that there is much more risk involved than there actually is. And from my perspective as a scientist, and I think some of my colleagues feel the same way, is we need to conduct good science to inform people what that risk actually is, and then people can make an informed decision. Right? When you get in your car, you probably don't know the exact statistics, but I could blow out a tire at 65 miles an hour in Freshman Road, or I can be rear-ended at a stoplight, whatever. And you have a sense of what that risk is, and you choose, I'm going to drive, I'm not going to drive. We don't have good data in football, or any sport for that matter, as to kind of what those, not so much, we have data on the short-term risk, we don't have data on the long-term risk, and I think that's where as scientists, we need to produce that information for people. Okay. You said a brain after concussion, it looks the same as normal. Is there any deterioration is a brain of someone who's had a concussion one time the same as someone who's had maybe 8 or 9? I'm not a pathologist. I can't answer that specifically. My understanding is that they would look similar, at least on kind of a gross level. So if you were to open two skulls up, 1 injury, 9 injuries, they would look roughly the same. Now, some of this depends on the severity of the magnitude of the impacts. So somebody that's been involved, they were close to like a blast explosion or something like that. Or they had better example, they had a penetrating wound. Like there's a structural injury because you had a penetrating wound. So all things being equal, 9 sport concussions, 1 sport concussions. From a gross anatomy standpoint, is my understanding is they would look the same. When you get down to a cellular level, that gets a little outside of my range. So I don't want to answer that. I couldn't answer that one intelligently. Yeah.
The cellular level you mentioned before, that's kind of something that that's still being researched in relation to.
Right. This kind of gets into CTE, and do you start seeing tau protein deposits, or tau protein deposits only related to concussion, or is it also related to repetitive head impacts? And we don't have a good answer on that yet.
Mm-hmm. That's still in the works.
Yeah, we can't. I can't go open up the brain of a 25-year-old that's played football for 5 years and say, how's it looking here?
Yeah.
We don't have that ability to do that yet. People are starting to develop different markers, right? So you can inject a dye, let's say, and it binds to that tau protein, and then you can image the marker, and then you can see if there's different deposits. And people are working on that. Even if that is there, we still don't exactly know what it means. because there are certainly other neurological disorders where, like Alzheimer's is a good example. You can open up some Alzheimer's brains, they look perfectly normal, and then you open up others and they have the same amyloid plaques and tau proteins all over the place. And so finding exactly what it means, that's another story.
Okay. And what sport that you've seen over the years kind of has maybe, I guess, the most concussions, and I guess what would have? So we'll go with most concussions, the greatest magnitude of concussions in terms of which sport has seen probably the worst of it, and which sport kind of they've had the concussions, but it's not as bad as other sports.
Well, I'll take your second question first. As far as which one has which injuries are worse than others? I guess
we can back off that question for a second. I guess are all concussions the same in effect, or are some less?
Yeah, they're all going to be basically. When we talk about in a sporting context, unless we're talking about downhill skiing, bicycle racing, high velocity sports, automobile racing. Those kind of fall in a different category, because then you start talking about moderate and severe injuries, brain bleeds and skull fractures and those sorts of things. So they kind of fall in a different category in my mind. When we talk about is the concussion in baseball or soccer worse than the ice hockey football one, they're all about the same as far as we know. So this is one of the things we want to look at with this NCAA project, is to see are there different recovery rates, male-female differences, and that sort of thing. But for the most part, they're going to be the same. Which sports have had the worst of it? Football definitely gets the most attention. Ice hockey is right there. Soccer, lacrosse, those are probably the biggest ones. I have to go back and look at some epidemiological data to give you solid numbers. I think the issue with football is that it just it's the most popular. It's the biggest. I think it's the biggest in the United States, but I think I think the issue with football is that it's the biggest sport in the United States, so it gets the most attention. Mm-hmm. But then if you think globally, soccer is the most popular sport in the world. So if you were to extrapolate concussions on a global basis, then soccer would be on top for the number of injuries. Okay. So it just kind of depends on how you want to look at it and what your perspective is.
And then you mentioned the change in the game and safety. Do you think there's? Maybe you don't have experience with it. You've seen it around, but whatever way you have, do you believe there's a more refined sense among coaches at all levels, just to say, especially 2015, safety comes first. If we don't score a touchdown, making sure our kid is okay is priority.
Yeah, I think it's a changing culture. I think you see a lot of criticism, op-eds and comment sections at the bottom of a website article or something, and we need to protect our kids and that sort of thing. Changing culture takes a long time. It's not something that happens overnight, and I do think it is changing. Certainly when I started, particularly doing field work, 2005, 2006. It was not taken as seriously as it is today. So when I started, and we would do things, and I would say, hey, coach, this kid's got a concussion. It's Wednesday. I don't think he's going to play on Friday. I would get a lot of pushback. Now, same scenario. Coach is like, just let me know when he's ready, and there's no pushback. So I definitely think it's a changing culture. People are much more aware of it. People want to address it appropriately. They want to do the right thing. But it still is going to take some time before everybody's on board, everybody's on the same page. But we're getting there. We're definitely making progress.
So the games have been changed too, like you mentioned, kind of the targeting rule that football has.
Right.
Do you ever see something like in soccer where there won't be heading allowed? Or
people have called for no heading under the age of 12 or 14 or whatever. I don't know the exact amount of ages, but part of that is we don't have good evidence to support those types of things. And the issue with heading is not heading the ball, it's the head-to-head contact. So two people going over a ball simultaneously and colliding heads. At least that's where the concussions come from. Now, repetitive head impacts from heading is a different story. I shouldn't say different story. We don't know the answer to that, because a ball is much more malleable. it kind of collapses on the head when you make contact, not like skull to skull type of work. But there might be, those are things to look at. Where do the concussions come from during an event? Are people that hit a ball more frequently, more or less likely to have long-term effects? But until we have those answers, we really can't. We can't make. It's ill-advised to make those rules changes because you're just changing a rule to change a rule without any evidence to support it.
Which is the goal of the research.
Exactly.
And then you mentioned how maybe a decade ago, concussion research protocol wasn't necessarily taken as heavy as it should. How has the just concussion protocol changed? Can you just kind of take me through that with your experience with maybe some coaches
Sure,
or just a player who wants to get back in the game, but you're like, no, you're not getting
right. Yeah. So I think if you go back probably 2 decades, the diagnostic criteria were you were much less likely to diagnose somebody with a concussion. Loss of consciousness was thought to be the key marker. If they were knocked out, they have a concussion. Otherwise, they got their bell rung, which is a horrible term. But that's what was used. And if they got their bell rung, then if their symptoms cleared within 20 minutes, you'd put them back in. And now that's it's a concussion now, and then they're done for the day. Right? So that's been a major shift. Loss of consciousness was identified 15 years ago or so to not be the sole predictor. It only occurs in about 10% of injuries. So now we start looking at kind of more altered mental status. So do they know where they are? Can they remember a short series of words? Do they have good concentration? So those types of things factor into making that concussion decision, the diagnostic decision. How is their motor control? Is their balanced? Is their gait normal? That type of thing. So that those types of things right there have shifted in how we diagnose the injury. We've also now moved away from, Johnny got his bell rung on Wednesday. He's fine on Thursday or Friday morning, so we're going to let him play Friday night. Now the protocols are all these return to play progressions that people implement. So yes, his symptoms have cleared, but he has to be exerted in incremental stages, starting with walking to running to doing cutting maneuvers to doing sport-specific drills to playing contact practice or a full-go practice before we'll allow him back into a game. Right? And all that takes time, so it's additional time on top of kind of just the general recovery process. And it's to protect the athlete. We want to make sure that they're completely healed before they go back into the game, or at least unrestricted practices, to make sure that they're not at risk for a second injury.
So, just so I understand it too, so, the guy going across the middle in a football game who just gets not beat out of him, and two soccer players who make contact in midair, and player A gets a concussion, guy running across the middle gets a concussion, the effects and everything and the severity of it are pretty much all the same. Right.
So it's only in football, but it speaks to your example. We have head impact biomechanics on 26, 27 different concussions, right? And the magnitude of those ranges from something that you would look at and go, how can that be a concussion, to pretty severe impacts when kids do get concussions. The outcomes from those injuries, there's no difference. We cannot show that the magnitude of the injury predicts how severe the outcomes will be. And we're not exactly sure why that is. I think a lot of it is there's a lot of things in there that we can't quite measure or account for yet. Right? So there's individual differences. Right? So you're going to have a different tolerance to head impacts than I will have. We have data to show that my tolerance to head impacts changes by the day. Right? So if I have a concussion in, let's say, the 4th week of a season at 100 Gs, let's say, head acceleration. We have data from the 3 weeks prior with impacts exceeding 100 Gs where I have no concussion. Right? So my tolerance has changed by the day. We can't show where the number of impacts leading up to the concussion influences your risk. We can't show where the number of impacts after your concussion, because injuries don't always get reported, so we have post-injury data, where that influences your outcomes. So all these things we can't predict, nor can we show that like the severity of the impact is going to predict. Now, intuitively, that does not make sense to us, right? If I'm in a car crash at 20 miles an hour, right, that's going to be a better scenario for me than if I'm in a car crash at 60 miles an hour, right? So that's one of the things we're struggling with, where intuitively it doesn't make sense to us that these lesser magnitude impacts, the outcomes aren't better than the more severe ones. But at this point, we can't. We're either not measuring something that we need to be, or we're not doing something statistically or whatever to show that these outcomes are worse.
Okay. Can you take me through the head acceleration you mentioned? Can you just kind of take me how that plays a role in concussions?
Yeah, so we have a system. It's called the Head Impact Telemetry System, and it's kind of a horseshoe-shaped unit that fits inside of a football helmet. It's specific to football, and it measures how fast the head is moving after an impact. So, and that what we do is in high school athletes, we fit, depending on the year, probably 35 to 45 guys on the team with the system. And in real time, we can track every impact, location, and magnitude that every player on the team gets during the year. So we've been doing that since about 2006 or 2007, something like that. And we've been fortunate. We published a number of papers off of it. And, it was kind of our first step into the high school world. We've kind of expanded with different projects within high school students, but the first step.
Okay. And then you mentioned too how each person is affected differently, and levels to somebody gets bigger from high school to college, they're more apt to not be affected, or just be affected in different ways. I've read a lot on youth football and how young kids are affected by hits to the head. Do you have any knowledge of youth football, or is that kind of similar to like a high school to college?
Yeah, so there's some groups that are starting to look at youth football players and some of the biomechanical data that's coming out of it. I haven't seen anything that says they're worse off, better off. The data is really preliminary at this point. The number of impacts they take is definitely a lot less than what we see at the high school and the college level. But I haven't seen anything that says, at the midseason they're showing declines, postseason they're showing declines. Long term they have these issues. I haven't seen anything like that.
Is there any, for a young kid, is there different brain development going on at that part in time that might come into play?
I mean, there's certainly people have speculated that the brain is, let's say like
a wrong number down or something.
People have certainly speculated that kind of in that 12, the brain doesn't really stop maturing until kind of mid-late 20s. But let's say kind of in that early teen years, you kind of get that growth spurt. There's a lot of brain development going on. So people have speculated that the youth football athlete might be a little more susceptible to long-term changes. But again, I haven't seen any solid data on it that really supports that theory.
Okay. And then just as far as for a player's safety, just looking at that a little bit, do you think there's more to it than a coach telling, hey, tackle this way, or this is the right technique, and making sure they perfect that? Is there more to playing the game the right way in terms of not being as injury prone?
Yeah, I mean, I think appropriate tackling techniques. I think that's a big part of it. Certainly, 10 years ago, SportsCenter would highlight these head downs. They're not spearing, but kind of head first. That would be the play of the day.
Yeah.
And I think we're moving away from that. And I think the heads up technique that's out there. There's some really unique stuff coming out of the University of New Hampshire, where they're training individuals to tackle without the helmet on. So they go through different drills without the helmet on. So when they get into a game or a live scrimmage with the helmet on, they're kind of automatically move their head out of the way. So there's some people are really trying some unique things on how to teach people to tackle in a safe way, and to kind of move away from this kind of pure brute force. I think that the game was at 5 or 10 years ago.
And then, just as far as, is there any difference between male, female in terms of concussions, or is that just kind of the same?
So if you look at comparable men's and women's sports, the female athletes have higher reporting rates than the men do. So men's and women's soccer, men's and women's lacrosse, men's and women's hockey, women always consistently have higher reporting rates. Nobody knows exactly why. There's a few theories that have floated out. So women definitely have weaker neck musculature. So once they're hit, they can't control their head quite as well. That's one theory. Some people have said, well, women are just more susceptible to injury. Don't know if I buy that, but it's out there. I think my personal belief is that women are more honest in their reporting than men tend to be. So I think that women athletes are incredibly tough, but I think if we look across injuries and different conditions as a whole, women have higher reporting rates on a lot of things because they're more willing to talk about it. They're more worried about their immediate health and their long-term health, right? So a female athlete is worried about how they're going to function, in school or whatever, and the male athlete may be more likely to, I just want to get back out there. I don't want to be seen as weak. I don't want to let my teammates down. I don't want to let my coach down. I'm generalizing here, but these are some of the theories that people have. So with that, we also know that female athletes take longer to recover, 3-4 days longer than male athletes. And it's probably this. My feeling is that it's probably the same reason. As a female athlete is more likely to say, you know what, I still have a headache. 10 days post injury, I'm going to sit out for another day or two. Male athletes like, no, headache's gone, I'm good. Put me back in. And so those reporting periods are not necessarily the longer reporting periods are not necessarily based on the biology of the injury, but more honest reporting by the female athletes. That's my personal take on that.
Okay. And then, just looking too at the diagnosis and the prognosis for concussion, are there, obviously, what kind of tests are there that are done to diagnose a concussion, and then what's kind of done as time goes on?
Right. So there is no diagnostic test for concussion. So there's no imaging technique that you can use. There's no blood draw. There's no saliva test. There's no biomechanical variables you can look at. None of that. Nothing works. With a sensitivity that is good enough for clinical use. So a concussion diagnosis is actually made off of the clinical exam. So the athletic trainer that's there, the physician that may or may not be on the sidelines, would be their clinical impression of the athlete and deciding whether or not they have a concussion. Now what can be done is that clinical decision can be supported by a number of different tools. So we have symptom evaluations. So asking the athlete, do you have a headache? Do you feel fatigued? Do you feel nauseous? Those types of things. But we know that's prone to lying, right? The athlete could say, no, I'm fine. We have what are called neurocognitive exams. These are computer tests. So remember a series of words, remember a series of shapes, counting backwards in various sequences, and that type of thing, reaction time tests. Those are okay tests. You can't really do a computer test on the sideline, so that's an issue there. But it works well kind of maybe after a game when you're in a quiet environment. People have added in balance tests. So how well, particularly when somebody closes their eyes and they're concussed, they can have difficulty with balance. So measuring how well they balance is another thing. So individually, the symptoms, the neurocognitive testing and the balance testing, they're not great. They're accurate a little bit more than 50% of the time. But the advantage is when you use all three of them together, your accuracy of picking out somebody with a concussion goes into the 90s. So really stressing that using all three of them again, these are used to support the clinical exam. They're not definitive one way or the other. But using all three of them combined can really help somebody make that decision.
And do you see the communication process with coaches and players? Do you see that growing into a more positive just step?
Yeah, I mean, I think before coaches would question, how do you know he has a concussion, and how long is he going to be out? And I don't believe you. And I talked to him; he seemed fine to me. And that definitely happened 10, 15 years ago. More and more, I think the coaches are becoming educated on kind of the different tests that are out there, the prognosis of the injury, what to expect after the injury. And so it is, Johnny has a concussion. These are the symptoms, and the coach says, "Okay, let me know what we can do to help." So there's definitely been a shift, and the coaches, I think, having the coaches on board is very helpful from like a medical management standpoint.
Okay. And then you mentioned the education too. That's something that you've probably seen an increase in, just in terms of awareness and maybe not knowing which protein is affected and all that, but just a general consciousness of this is a concussion and this is what we need to do to combat it.
Yeah, people are definitely way more educated about it, and I think the media has a lot to do with it. There's concussion is in the news. It's in the news weekly, if not daily. The flip side to that is there's a lot of misinformation that floats around, so sometimes you have to kind of reverse people and go, no, it's actually like this. We certainly now, kind of with all the CTE stuff, we have high school kids. We have a swimmer with a concussion. They tripped doing dry land training and hit their head, or slipped on the ice, and they have a concussion. I'm going to get CTE. It's like, you're not going to get CTE from one concussion. That's well managed. We have no evidence to suggest that. So, yes, it's been good and bad, right? The media has definitely brought it to the forefront. People know about it. They're much more willing to accept the injury for what it is and allow us to manage it appropriately. But at the same time, it's put a lot of unnecessary fear into the public that is not based on any science.
And you talked about the reporting of athletes reporting their injury, and especially males may not report as much. Given recent changes among NCAA, I guess, kind of standards and hopes by athletes in terms of maybe getting paid at the college level and that kind of stuff, do you think there's more of a business? There's almost more of a business side to college in terms of somehow how maybe some players view themselves as I need to get in the game and showcase my skills, or there's the other side where there's the players who are I'm good enough. I need to make sure I'm safe so I can get to that next level.
I think it depends on the athlete and the sport. So certain sports, there is no real career beyond the college level. The Olympic sports, the non-revenue sports, unless you're going to go be on the field hockey national team, there's no professional field hockey league, right? Mm-hmm. Football, basketball, maybe some soccer, maybe some baseball. I should say maybe, but baseball. There's life after college, but it's still such a small percentage of players that go on. But I think the reporting comes down, I think, to the culture of those sports. And I think the ability for an athlete to say, yeah, I'm injured without fear of losing his or her spot on the team. Sports is an interesting beast, and it provides a lot of entertainment to us. It is a business at all levels. Well, definitely at the college and the professional level, it's a business. And I think those athletes, I think they understand, particularly in the revenue sports, if they're going to go on, that they've got to be out there. And I think that's part of the motivation that people try to play through the injury.
Do you think, is there ever a sense, maybe, if any athletes you've worked with or maybe stories you've seen out there where, a guy or girl, they maybe didn't listen necessarily to suggestions and it turned out in a negative way for them?
I can't say as I know of anybody specifically, but certainly there are certainly cases out there where somebody has an injury, they hide it, they continue to play, they have a second injury that takes them out for the rest of the season, takes them out for a career. At the high school level, at the youth level, there's a phenomenon known as second impact syndrome, which is basically it's a second injury prior to resolution of the first, where the brain, the pressure regulation of the brain goes haywire. So the brain starts to swell. It's inside the cranium. It's inside a fixed box, and it really kind of gets crushed inside of there. The swelling is so much. So it results in death a large percentage of the time. If somebody survives it, there's typically long-term brain damage, permanent brain damage that's associated with it. So it's rare, but it happens. But that's the sort of thing that we don't want to see happen at all.
That's what I was going to ask you that. What if there was a case of somebody who gets a concussion and then they maybe hide it and go back in? So that kind of is the process.
I mean,
of what
it
could happen.
happened. And that's at the like high school youth level. We don't see it in adults for some reason. No one's really sure why. But it definitely happens for sure.
Is that maybe brain development? Or?
It might be. I mean, that's what most people speculate, but
Okay.
nobody's really sure why.
Okay. And then in terms of injuries, the main character for my piece is Clint Trickett. He retired in December from several concussions over his career. Is there ever a point in time where you might look at an athlete and, like Clint, for instance, I think he had half a dozen, if not more.
Mm-hmm.
And is there ever a point in time where you might sit down with an athlete and advise them to do something like Clint and retire, or is there ever? Obviously it's their call at the end of the day,
Right.
but is there ever a point in the concussion in an athlete's life endurance of the sport where so many injuries adds up to sit down discussion and we need to have a serious talk about it?
Yeah. So there's no magic number. We used to kind of say, more than 3 type of thing, and that's clearly not the case anymore. Every athlete is going to respond differently. Every concussion has a different impact on how that athlete functions. So really, I don't do any athlete counseling as far as that goes, but when I talk to my friends that have clinical practice, I think what they look for is a change in the baseline function. Right? So the athlete, he functioned like this before his 3rd or 4th injury, and now he's kind of down here. He never returned to normal. That's a reason that you might want to talk to an athlete. The concussions he's getting or she's getting are resulting from less and less force. So it's kind of, the first impact is like really severe, and then it's like, go on, and then it's like a little bump to the head, and they're out for 3 weeks or something. And then I think if you have somebody that has really prolonged symptoms that don't resolve, that would be something that you would counsel them. Maybe it's time to stop playing their sport. When it happens at the youth level, I think a lot of times we try to counsel kids to just go into lower risk sports. So if it's a hockey player, maybe you take them over to, take them into some running or some tennis or something like that. And I know that sounds like a big shift, but I think the goal is we don't want to push people away from sports and physical activity. Certainly lack of physical activity is a much bigger issue because we get straight into like overweight, obesity, metabolic syndrome, like all those things that we know are associated with inactivity. So we want to keep kids active. We know that physical activity is good for the brain in the long term. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you might have to retire somebody from football, but we still want them to be active, long term.
We mentioned a concussion and its kind of symptoms are all the same no matter the magnitude of one. Is concussion number 7 the same as concussion number 1 in terms of maybe a deterioration of specific functions in the human body?
Yeah, it just depends on the individual, where the injuries were, where the injury, specifically the injury in the brain is. So we'll see cases where somebody will have, very few symptoms and then just horrible balance, but all their other cognitive functions are fine. And then we see the converse where they have a lot of symptoms and the cognitive function is horrible, but their balance is perfect. So it just depends. Every injury is different, and you got to manage every one of them differently. Even within the same individual that's had multiple injuries, they don't respond the same every time.
It's just a clean slate with each one that comes along.
Yeah, but knowing they've had prior injuries is helpful because people do tend to take a little bit longer with each successive injury. But that's not entirely true. Don't cut that out. knowing they have had previous injuries, you might want to manage them a little more conservatively to hold them out a little bit longer, just to make sure they're fully recovered. But again, that's a clinical decision that's kind of made on the ground.
Okay. And then you mentioned too CTE a lot, and that's just, I mean, that's with the suicides and deaths, and especially in football that have come out in the news. That's kind of been the new connection, I guess, if you will. What's do you have a baseline knowledge of just what that is, and kind of maybe, I guess, just what is it?
Yeah, so CTE is thought to be the result of repetitive head impacts, both concussive and non-concussive. And it's a kind of a breakdown of kind of the supporting tissue around the neurons in the brain. And they release this protein called tau, and that protein deposits in and around the brain. And it blocks different pathways in the way that the brain functions. It's been linked to suicide, although it's been anecdotally linked to suicides. There was a nice paper by Grant Iverson that showed that the suicide rates of NFL players is actually it's either the same or lower than the general population. So there's some real question as to whether or not that link is true or not. But this is kind of one of the things that floats in the media, where everybody thinks like, Junior Seau is a really good example. I mean, he committed suicide. The autopsy of the brain, he definitely had CTE, but Junior also was bipolar for his entire life. And football was his outlets, and so was it the CTE or did the bipolar disorder just finally get the best of him? And I think one of the things that happens is when you have an NFL player, particularly in the last few years, you have an NFL player that commits suicide, it gets a lot of attention. And so you kind of get this automatic association with NFL player, brain injury, and then CTE.
Is there any, this is going to sound really weird, but it just popped into my mind. Is there any sort of, I guess, the proteins that work with CTE, is there any sort of like a sense of how powerful they are or anything like that? Is there a sense of, do they work differently than any other protein?
It's not so much like do they work. It's like, as I understand it, you have these like supporting structures around the neuron, and so when the brain gets shaken and twisted, they crack, they break, and these proteins leak out, and then they just kind of deposit. They just sit there. It's like, I almost want to call it like a tar. Okay. That's not accurate, but it's kind of like a tar that just like clings on and it sits there. So it's not like inactive type of thing. It just is kind of, I guess it's inactive. It just kind of sits there and it blocks that pathway.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Yeah,
I'm not like a cell level guy, so we talk to this.
Yeah. Do you see that kind of beyond what the research that you're helping lead with the NCAA and DoD? Do you see that kind of down the line? Is that something that will be, once concussions are out and maybe there's more of, maybe if there's more scenarios that CTE is exploited in, do you think that can be a larger area of study down the road?
Yeah, I think it's something, like right now our plans aren't to do autopsies on any of our participants, but I think it's something that if someone developed a marker that we could detect on MRI or CT, then we could certainly think about adding that into our protocol where we would do scans. Certainly, that kind of thinking about it, the feasibility of doing that within the next 3 years, 4 years, probably pretty low. But 10 years, 20 years from now, I can definitely see where, okay, this marker's out, we know it works. We're going to bring back the 350 people that had concussions at certain intervals, and we'd like to do these scans with and looking for this marker. So I can certainly see where that could happen in 10 years or 20 years from now.
And then just looking a little bit more specifically at football, you mentioned the repeated hits, and that's kind of something that CT has a background from. Is there a chance that, obviously, there's players that take hits on every play to the head. Is there a certain extent of brain damage that goes on that might not necessarily lead to a concussion at the time, but is a baseline of some sort of structural damage to the brain that goes on each play, perhaps?
We don't know. Right, so certainly different players on the field have different number of hits. So linemen are the obvious one. They're involved with every play, so they're going to get hit on every play. Receivers, backs, quarterbacks, they don't get hit nearly as often, right? Now, but when they get hit a lot harder than the lineman does, right? So it becomes this kind of trade-off of fewer number of hits, higher magnitude, greater number of hits, lower magnitude. It comes to this balance. What we don't know is kind of what's that minimum threshold where something structural is actually going on, like a microscopic structural thing is going on. Is it 20 Gs? Is it 30 Gs? The brain can withstand a certain amount of force, right? Otherwise, walking down the street or just running in general would cause brain damage. We know that's not true. So the brain can withstand a certain amount of force, but we don't know really what that magnitude is. And so that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to understand. Where do we put the cut line? It's time to say, okay, anything above this level is not good for you.
Okay. So it can, like you said, the brain can withstand a certain amount of force, but we don't necessarily know exactly what that is. Okay. And then I don't know. The key word I think around a lot of the research is like the markers, and you've said that a lot. Do you think? Obviously, like you said, you're not going to run an autopsy on someone who's, playing soccer here or anything like that. But do you ever think maybe concussions are going to be a mystery for all time, or will we ever know the full functionality of a brain and how it works?
I think we'll figure it out eventually. I don't know if we will. I don't think we'll understand the brain in its entirety in my lifetime, to be quite honest. But we know way more than we did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Are we going to have concussion figured out in another 10 years? It's a tough one. 30 years maybe. I'm just trying to think of the span of the project that we're proposing, and it will take a lifetime. We're basically going cradle to grave. The ideal study would be enroll a bunch of people when they're born, track every impact and anything that can influence cognitive health from the cradle, follow up when they're dead, and see kind of how it all falls out. But that takes a lifetime. It's 60, 70, 80 years. So we're kind of starting at the 20-year point. These kids are 18 to 22 years old, and trying to track them, moving forward from that point. And of course, we're getting background history on them too. What sports did you play in high school and junior high, and how many previous injuries have you had, and that sort of thing. So I think we'll have a good sense. I think we'll have a very good sense of what concussion is acutely within the first 2 weeks to a month of injury. We'll have that sorted out within the next 3 to 5 years. To understand what concussion means 30 years after you've had one, 40 years after one, it's going to take 30 or 40 years. It'll take us that long to collect the data to answer the question.
And then you talked a lot about how football is in the news so much, and just obviously because of the popularity of the sport. But is there any sense of not treating football differently than other sports, but almost looking more at the impacts that are involved in it related to concussions? Is there any looking at just that kind of aspect of it more, just the impacts and the concussion numbers?
So I think people have focused on, within the scientific literature, I think people have focused on football or given more attention to football. I think because of its popularity. But that hasn't stopped people from also looking at soccer and ice hockey, and people are starting to get into lacrosse now. So I think all those sports are being examined. I think just the bulk of research has been on football, largely because it represents the biggest cohort of people, active people with the highest risk of injury.
Is there any concussion that you have ever seen with an athlete that really sticks out in your mind ever?
I had one kid, I'm trying to think how long ago it was, maybe 6 years or so ago, that it actually wasn't the concussion, but he had a concussion, but he had a simultaneous C-spine injury. And he was fine. We had a spine board, and he got transported and had surgery, and he's fine. Actually came back to play a year or so later. But that was one where, yeah, there was a concussion associated with it, but it was the C-spine injury that was much more. That one sticks out.
Mm-hmm.
Sticks out. I was a new parent at the time too, so kind of
To hit a little harder.
hit close to home.
I think the last one I have that I can think of for you. I just forgot. What was it? I guess if I'll kind of think about it. Can you just talk about your relationship with Scott, how you know him, work with him? What you've done?
Scott's one of our site PIs for the CARE Consortium. I'm trying to think if we had met before. I don't think we had met before, kind of like the last 3 or 4 months or whatever. But he's been awesome. You know, he's a really laid back guy, but at the same time, he gets the job done. And I know he's been out. He's participated in some concussion research for a while. I know he was involved in the original NCAA study, 10 years ago or something. And so he actually came recommended for some other people. We were looking for our initial sites, and some people, his name popped up from a couple of people. So, but he's a good guy, man.
Yeah, he is. I remember the question. The whiplash you talked about. Is there, I guess how bad can whiplash affect the brain, and maybe how have you seen it affect?
Yeah, it's all about how strong the impulse is, right, and how fast the head moves after the impact. That's really what it comes down to. Somebody that, so an individual, a player that sees the impact coming, you kind of automatically tighten your neck down, and it's like a defensive posture. That person will have, if they get hit around the chest, they will have less head motion, less of this whiplash motion than somebody who doesn't see it coming and their head's kind of like bobbing around. So how bad can a whiplash injury be relative to a direct impact? It just depends. Do they see it coming? How strong is their neck? We've seen data where the accelerations, head acceleration after impact actually goes up over time, like in a football game. And that to us suggests that the neck muscles are becoming tired and they can't brace quite as well. It's a very gentle trend. It's not like dramatic at all, but it's there. So, but we don't see a higher rate of concussions in like the fourth quarter of the game. Right? So, kind of what those things mean, not quite sure. So how bad can whiplash be? It can be the same, it can be better, it can be worse than just a direct impact to the head. It just depends on how hard it is and whether or not the person's ready for it.
Okay.